All right, so here we are. Notice on the left-hand side again, we have a module for each week that we're going to be meeting, and right now we're in this module, the user interface development module, and you're responsible for the material under each one of these sections. Okay, there's quite a few videos that have been recorded. There's some lecture notes for each one of the videos and topics that we're going to be covering. A lot of this is very basic stuff. HTML, CSS, that I assume that most of you are already familiar with this, and probably would feel very bored if I covered it here in class. But nevertheless, you're responsible for this, right? And so anything that is here can be on the quiz, right? On how to do simple tables, how to do something simple CSS, some simple HTML. Also, we have here several sections specific on different topics, on CSS in general, the box model in general, layout, Bootstrap, very, very brief introduction to Bootstrap. As well, there are some examples here, right? Some that you can select here to drop down and just look at some of the examples here. So you're responsible for being familiar with what's here. Okay, the quizzes are open book. You can take a look at this source code during the quiz, but the quiz is very, very short, so you should already know where things are, right, if you need to refer to it. Okay. So I'd like to just go over some of these, right, just to get you familiar with some of these examples that we were giving you, so you become familiar where things are, where you can find them, how to become accustomed to them. Okay. These are all throwaway examples, right? So they're only introducing a particular concept, right? It's not meant to be industry strength examples, right? They're just throwaway examples just to introduce a particular concept. Okay. So let me see the in particular the box model. Did we talk about the box model yesterday? Right. That every time the browser renders something on the screen, it uses the two policies of either block or inline, and also uses the box model to determine the margins, the borders, the paddings, and the inner widths and heights. We talked about that yesterday, right? I think so. Yes. Another thing that I wanted to mention is positioning. Right. Notice that a lot of my examples are hosted on JS Fiddle. So you can click on it and take a look at the source code and play around with it on your own, change it, and rerun it to just a small test bed, so you can play around with and learn from these examples. So notice what's happening here is that we have a div that is just sitting on top of everybody else. See that? It's and the way we achieved that was to override the positioning policy that the browser uses by default. If you remove the position absolute and you rerun this, the typical way to render this would be to render this content, right, and then it pushes down everything else, right, everything that follows. Okay, if you bring back the position absolute, you're telling the browser, saying, hey, I don't want you to handle the positioning, right? I'm gonna take over this, right? So there are several configurations for the position. One of them is absolute, and like the name suggests, it absolutely positions this content with respect to its parent, right? So here, the parent is this div, outer div here, right? And we are telling it that we wanted to absolute position this and give it a left and a right and a top and a left position. Off of the 0, 0, that is its parent, the top left corner of its parent. Okay, and notice that it's floating on top of everything else. Since we've taken over the rendering of this box, it no longer participates in the top level policies, right? Of from left to right, from top to bottom, and everything just pushes the next thing, right? So notice that it's not pushing the bottom content. So it's being removed from the regular flow of the content, and then the browser just says, well, you handle it on your own with your positioning. Everything else I'll keep following my normal flow of the content. So that's why it's underneath, right? If this content is being pushed by this content, but not this no longer participates in that calculation of positioning everybody else. That makes sense? Right? It's being removed from there, and there's quite a few interesting effects that we can accomplish by using these types of positioning. Let's look at another one, the centering. So a very common way to lay out a page is to have it centered on the screen, and to achieve that, the common way to do it is to give that content. Notice that my content is here, right, and it's has a divider, right? There's a rectangle, and all the content is inside of that one div. And notice that we've tagged it with a class of centered, and then in the CSS we can then refer to that one div, right, using a class selector. We're saying we're referring to that element that has a class centered. We're using this dot here. We're saying, hey, everybody who has the centered class, right, the centered class, I'm going to modify some of its attributes. I'm going to change its width to be 600, or it could be something else, maybe 300. You can rerun it. And so I'm modifying its width. Its default width. Its default width is that all divs, what they want to do by default is take up the entire width of the page. Okay, or the entire width of its parent container, right? The parent container being this outer box here, right? So it wants to expand, right, all the way to the edges of its parent container. Unless we tell it otherwise. We're saying here that I explicitly want you to be 300 pixels wide. Okay. Then if we remove this margin and we rerun it, the default is to justify left. Right. That's the default. Or if you want to center, right, you could use margins. Margins, if you remember, margins allow you to push things away from each other, right? If you have different pieces of content, margin says how far do I want to be from my surrounding neighbors, right? So I could say a margin to my left of perhaps 300 pixels. If I run it, that means that so this is 300 pixels. And this is 300 pixels, right? So I want to be away 300 pixels, right? You can achieve more or less the same effect if you use perhaps padding, right? Right now you can't see the difference, but remember that padding and margins, right? Margins is the distance between me and my next neighbor, right? Whereas padding is the distance between my border, right, and where the content begins, right, and the entire distance, right, is the summation of both the margin plus the padding. And if you have a border, well, that too, right, whatever the width of the border that might be, right. So you have to take into account these things. Anyway, I did want to point out margin though. Margin, you can leave the margin as auto, and this is a very common technique for centering content right in the middle, right? This basically says, hey, I want to be 300, and the distance between me and the rest of my neighbors, you figure it out. We're telling the browser, you figure it out, right? Meaning whatever's left over, okay? So that's why as we modify the width of the parent, notice that it's always centered, right? It's whatever is left over. Make it symmetric, right? And just leave that. Does that make sense? It's a very common technique for centering content. All right. The other is sticky. Another very common thing to do is to have content that it scrolls as you move your mouse, but you have some content that is stuck to the top or stuck to the bottom. Okay. We often call them sticky footers or sticky headers. It's also always used quite a bit to stick something in the middle, right in the center, so that it follows you as you scroll. So notice what's happening here. to achieve these this content to be stuck to the top of the bottom, we use the position again, right? Before we said that it was position absolute. Remember that? Right. This one is different. This is position fixed, right? Position fixed, and like the name suggests, it says let everything else scroll, but you don't scroll, right? You always stay to this particular position. The absolute, it moves, right? It puts it at a particular space, but it moves with the rest of the content, right? Whereas fixed, you can position anywhere on the screen, and then it does not is not affected by the rest of the scrolling. So let's take a look at the content. Notice that the sticky header is this one div at the top with a class of sticky header, which we're then referring to it from our CSS, and then we have a sticky footer down below, a sticky footer over here that is stuck to the bottom, and we are achieving that again using fixed, position fixed. Now, by default, let's see. Let's play around with this. If I remove this, right, this right, I already have a lot of contents. Let me remove some of the contents. Way too much content. Let's see. Let's remove some of this. Let's copy, cut that. Oops. Right, let me refresh. Just copy that. I just have some small content. Let's rerun that. There you go. Let's move this right. Run. Notice what's happening here. The div is stuck, right? It's stuck to where it says top 0 and left 0. But remember we said earlier that divs, what they want to do, typically, normally, is to take up the entire width of their parent. See that? That's the default behavior. But if you start overriding the position to be something other than the default, right, like fixed or absolute, they behave the opposite, right? Their size will be whatever their children are, whatever their children inside, right? If there's more content, they will try to accommodate the content that's inside, right? So you have to be mindful that the size, the default size of the div behaves differently depending on the rendering policies, right? So if we put more content, right? If we just put more content here, oops, go away. JS Fiddle is a pain in the butt sometimes when there it is. So wait, it came back. So let me put back. Let me just remove this again. Just have so much small content, and let me run that again. Okay, so notice that this is what I wanted to point out, right? So run it. JS Fiddle is a pain. It doesn't let me see the cursor. See, I press the cursor and it's not really there. See, I start typing somewhere else because when you resize it, it's not aware. Okay, let's see if that. Am I zoomed in? I am zoomed in. Thank you. Maybe that's what it is. Let me rerun that. Okay, so let me remove that, and yeah, but now you can't see, right? Notice that that it's taking up that width, and it's not stuck to the right-hand side. But we often want to have that behavior that is stuck to the right-hand side, even if the content is not forcing it to be that width, right? So to do that, notice that we are using top and left. That's why stuck to the top left. Right? We could move it around, right? 10 and 10, so we can just push it a little bit to the right or left, which it's still stuck, right? As we move things around, it doesn't scroll with the rest of the content. But nevertheless, we usually want it to be stuck just to the top left. But to stretch this so that it's stuck to the right-hand side, we can stretch it by overriding also the position of its right edge. What do we want to do with that, right? If we do that, notice that we're stretching it so that it's stuck to the right-hand side of its parent. Okay, and this is a very common thing to do to implement like headers, right, and put menus at the top. Typically, we also add some padding all around, maybe of 15 pixels all around, right? So that's not necessarily stuck and flush with its edges. Now, notice what might happen here if we start scrolling, right? Now the scrolling here is okay, right? But I do want to point out that by default, this is how it would behave, right? It would behave. Notice that the content is actually supposed to be lorem ipsum. The content is kind of like underneath the header. See that? It's underneath the header. And the reason is that, again, what we said earlier, right? Typically, if we don't have the position fixed, right? If we don't have the position fixed, it participates in the pushing its children or pushing its neighbors around, right? But when we remove it from the if we remove it from the regular rendering, it no longer pushes its neighbors, right? So it's showing as if it's under the header, right? That's a very common issue. There's a couple ways to solve that. One way is to grab that content, that main content, right, and just wrap it in a div all by itself. Where is it? It's too small. Where is it? I think it ends here. Oh, again, the cursor. Curse you, cursor. I guess I'm not going to use JS Fiddle next semester. All right, that looks right. There we go. And then grab this div, perhaps give it a class that we can get a hold of it. So this is the kind of like the main content, right? And to compensate for this, for the main content, kind of like going under the header, is that we could just push it down, a bit, right? So that to compensate for the space that we are no longer having that header, right? So we can grab that main content, and perhaps give it a padding at the top, padding top maybe 10 pixels. Maybe that's too little. Let's run this. Okay, we were able to push it down a little bit. That sounds more like 50. Let's try that. Okay, there it is. So now the scrolling starts at the beginning of the main content, right, and then it's scrolled. Another popular way of doing it is to just push the entire body, right, the entire body of the view of the page. Just push that down, right? Let's run that. Right, it has exactly the same effect, right? So whatever you choose, this here gives you more control of exactly what it is that you're pushing, right? But right then that means that you need to be consistent, and that all your main content you need to wrap it around with that particular div and that particular class. You just have to remember. Whereas this one is kind of like the entire website, right? It's assuming that you're going to have this header, and you're going to push the main content down. Yes?
So from what I'm noticing is that the HTML can see that there's another div above it. However, it doesn't see that there's extra space due to the CSS styling.
Right, exactly.
Is there a way, because it's basically just saying render after the div is done, not that the styling is done.
Mm-hmm.
But is there a way to do it so that it recognizes how far the styling is pushing it down, so that it's more like dynamic, I guess?
So not with CSS. CSS is static, right? It's declarative, and nothing is rendered until everything gets parsed, right? And it creates the data model, creates the domain object model. Once it has a domain object model, including the HTML, including the CSS, then the rendering engine starts rendering on the view, right? You can use media queries, right, to have some rules based on the size of the screen, perhaps. But if you want more behaviors, you need to add JavaScript. Yeah. Okay, so there it is. Let's look at yet another one. Another one is a zindex, and when you start taking over the default behavior of how things are rendered by default, then you start to you have to be a little more cautious on what is it exactly how you're rendering things, right? Well, with more power comes more responsibility. If you just let the browser decide where to position things, well, it's the browser responsibility. But when you start using fixed or absolute or any of these positioning policies, right, you start to run into problems of things that might fall on top of each other, or some things that might overlap one another. If you just leave it to the browser by default, the browser will never overlap anything on top of anything, right? Every piece of real estate on the screen is very well defined for, right? Everything is accounted for. But when you start overriding the default behavior, then you might end up with problems like this, right? Where some content overlaps other content, right? So now you have to consider things not on just being on regular 2D space, right? Just left, right, up, down, left, right, but also need to be, well, if things fall on top of each other, what do I want to render first, right? What gets rendered on top of what? And not that you would ever want to do this, but actually no, the assignment asks you to do this explicitly, to put something on top of something else, right? The toolbar, right, on the widgets, that needs to render on top of the widget, right? So you'll need to play around with these mechanisms. Anyway, when you have things that overlap, basically the browser default behavior is that things render in the order in which they are declared. So, for instance, box 1, which is yellow, right, will render first. Then it will look at box 2. That will render second, right? If it happens to overlap over box 1, it'll render on top of box 1, right? So it's basically document order, right? In the order in which the document is parsed, right? The last thing is rendered last. But you can override that. You can override that by using an index attribute that says, give me the depth, right? The z index, right? Not just x, y, but also the depth in which what comes first, what comes last. By default, all elements have the same index, z index, right? And so since everything has, if two elements have the same z index, then document order wins, right? It's whatever order they were declared in the file. But here you can override that, and notice that what we're doing here is that box 3, right? Box 3, which is red, right? Red would normally be the last element that is rendered, right? So it would render on top of box 2, which is blue, right? So red should be on top of blue, but it's not. We have overwritten it by giving the blue box a higher z index than the red one. Make sense? Right? By default, if we remove the z index, right? Remove the z indexes, right? And we rerun, the default is that it renders this way, right? Red is the last one in the document, is the one who's rendered on top of everybody else. Yes?
Does it like render even if it knows that it's going to be like there's going to be something on top of it? Does it render anyway?
It does.
Okay.
Yes.
So it's not like
No. Yep. Okay. Yeah, it's actually, the content is actually there, right? You can still inspect it and see that the content is still there, right? It's all there. Makes sense, right? You can override that, and so you'll play around with this a little bit on the assignment, right? To do the widgets, and certain things will fall on top of each other. Also, for instance, when you have headers, right, and you have things that are scrolling underneath, right? That too needs for you to be able to configure the z index, right? You want the headers and footers on top of the scrolling that scrolls underneath of it, right? So you need to sometimes force the index to achieve that behavior. Z index. Okay, so again, all these examples, please become familiar with them, play around with them on your own. You might be asked one of these in the quiz. Okay, Bootstrap. Let's see. Well, no, not yet. So layout. Let's look at layout real quick. All right. So CS Float. So CS Float allows us to create content such as this, right, where you have things that might render one side by side, like in columns, right? Things that normally you can't accomplish using HTML all by itself out of the box, right? And this was one of the first, one of the main reasons why tables were misused early on to accomplish this kind of layout, right? HTML doesn't have a native way to declare columns, right? So tables were very, very convenient. That allowed you to split it up into many columns, right, and have contents in them. But that has fallen out of favor. Don't do it in class. Certainly don't do it in industry. Don't only use tables for what they were originally meant for, tabular data. Right. There are other ways to achieve the same exact effect. Right. So let's play around a little bit with CSS float. Like the name suggests, float is for floating content. Content can float to the left-hand side or float to the right-hand side, and remove the content from the normal flow, right, of the rendering engine. It allows you to have content that would normally behave as blocks. It allows you to make them behave as if they were inline, right? So, for instance, these are three divs that normally would want to take up the entire width of their container, right? And so normally they would behave like block elements, but instead we've made them into three inline elements, so that if there's not enough space, right, it wraps. See that? They're behaving as if they were inline, right? There's not enough space, it just wraps, as if they were individual words, right, individual letters, and everything else would be spaces. So let's look at how to achieve this. Notice that these are just three divs, right? There's nothing peculiar about that, but we have tagged them with the following classes: yellow, blue, and red. And I believe the only thing that they do is to change their background color, right? But they're also been tagged with columns. So let's play around with this content. Let's grab this. Oh, actually, no, it's in JS Fiddle. Now I'm scared of using JS Fiddle. So by default, this would render as follows. So let's comment that out. All right, and let's rerun this. So by default, this is the way it would behave, right? Just divs that expand the entire width of its parent. They're behaving like blocks, and they accommodate the content that it's inside, right? So as you resize, the content pushes its height to accommodate for the inner content. Yes, right. Now as we change their sizes, say we uncomment just the size, and we make them all 200. So let's re-render that. Notice that I've made them 200. Notice that their width is small enough that it would allow for this to just fit right next to it, right? For these, but notice that even though there's enough space for these to just come up here, they're still being pushed vertically down, right? Even though even though we changed the width, that does not change the fact that they're still block elements, right? That they introduce that vertical spacing. Yes.
If you change the divs to a span, would it mimic the column styling that
yes.
you want? Okay.
Yep. Well, that's what we want, right? We want it to behave as if they were spans, right? The thing is that spans are too restrictive, right? They have a lot of many other things that they don't allow you to do that divs allow you to do. Yes.
What about if we made them inline block?
That would do the same thing. Yep. Yep. Right. So to achieve this the effect, right, of saying, hey, you stay to the left, right? I'm gonna remove you from the normal rendering in the document, and I'm just gonna follow rendering right to your to the left. I'm just gonna fill in from the left and just keep adding content. We can use a float, right? We can use float, and we can add that, and we can now say, okay, so as you're adding content to the left, everything falls and just falls to the left hand side, and everything else just wraps around, right? Wraps around this particular content. Okay. And we'll play around with this effect quite a bit. It's actually one of the main mechanisms that grid systems or grid layout systems they use to achieve things like this, right? Where you have a grid system, right? It allows you to kind of like re-implement tables without tables, right? Tables were a great model where you had the page. We allowed it to break it up into many rows, right? And each row break it up into many columns, and it's still very popular today. We have a couple hundred years experience of printing, the printing press industry, where we've been printing magazines and newspapers, and it's a very common way to display lots of content, right? To make it easier for bits, for the human eye to easily just parse, very long content, right? You minimize the width of the content, and so we're a lot of these grid systems, such as Bootstrap and many others, are copied from these other industries that have matured over hundreds of years. They copy from those same ideas as, hey, let's break up the page also into equal portions, right? A very common layout, a very common way to break it up into 12 equal sizes, right? So you can break it up into sixes, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or break it up into. Is that wait 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? Yeah. So you split it once again, right? Right. So it becomes 12 columns. 12 because it's an easy number to be divisible by different numbers. You can divide it by 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. It's easily to group it into different portions, right? So you can have a piece of content that is that takes up 2 columns and another piece of content that takes 10 columns, right? Or if you want something to be 50-50, you can have content that takes up 6 columns and then another one that takes up, again, 6 columns, right? And you can make any combination that you want, right, to break up the page into these constituent pieces, right? So what we have here is an example of creating a toy grid system, right? What we have here is just several divs, right? Several divs that have been tagged as rows, right? Notice here the row. And what they're trying to do is behave like you would have tables behave, table rows behave, right? They are, rows are collections of columns, right? So here we have a one row that contains 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. Here's another row that contains 4 columns, and then we have another row that contains 2 columns. Make sense? Right? And the way we achieve that is by, again, creating a div, giving it a class of row, which we'll see in a minute what the CSS looks like, and then several divs that represent the various columns, right? That ends right here. The first row ends right here with 6 columns. Yes? Right, so basically a parent div with then several, a parent div that represents the row, and then several child divs that represents the various columns. Make sense? Right? Now, the columns, the way we're implementing the column is, as you would surmise, right? We're using the float left, right? All these columns, if we want them to, render side by side, basically we just use float left on all these classes, right? Float left, so that will achieve these columns fitting one after another. Yes, right? What the grid system does is that it goes a little further and it says, "Ooh, let's take this idea, right, of floating, and build on that idea to be able to reenact, right, or reconstitute the same functionality that we can have with tables." First of all, one of the things that they do is that the outer div, or the parent row, what they do is that they use the following styling: clear both. So what clear both does is that it says, hey, if you were floating, right, and putting stuff so that it's rendered from left to right, stop that. Don't do that anymore. Go back to the normal rendering, right, of from top to bottom, from left to right. Go back to the default rendering, right? Stop floating. Right, so that makes sense, right? That's what rows do, right? You have a row, and only the columns should float left. Everything outside of the row should be normal, should render normally from left to right, from top to bottom. Yes? Right, but everything that's inside of the row, we can have the floating. So there it is. So we did that. Also, notice that the content here is centered. See that it's centered? We have margins to the left and right. And the way we achieve that is that we have an outer container, an outer div, see that? And then at the bottom we have a width of 600 pixels and a margins of auto. And we did that before, right? We saw the example earlier. That basically gives the container a particular width, and then the remainder space is just equally divided left and right. Yes? And that achieves the centering. But what I want to point out here is the width that we chose. Right, we chose 600 pixels. Yeah. Now this 600 pixel, I chose it because it's easily divisible by 2, by 3, by 4. It's a number easily divisible by several of these column values here. So for instance, if I want to be able to break up the page into 2 halves, right? Then that means that the column on the left-hand side needs to be half of the outer width. Right, that needs to be 300, and this needs to be 300. Make sense? So that content, these 2 columns, note that this is the last row. This is the very last row that has these 2 columns. These are the 2 columns. There they are, right? And they both have column 6 and column 6. See that? Notice that they both add up to 12, right? Because we agreed that we're going to break up the page into 12 equal portions. Yes. And what size do they need to be? Well, if the outer width is 600, then each one needs to be 300 and 300, and that's exactly what we have here, right? The column 6, right there, 300 with 300, and they're float left. See that? Makes sense, right? And that's what achieves being able to split it from left and right, equal portions, 300 and 300. And the size of 300 pixels is determined by the size that you choose your page to be. Yes? Right? It's a standard width that you can choose. If you want to split up if instead you want to split it up into 4 columns, that means that they're going to divide the 600 into that many elements. All right? So it's divided by 4. So that means that each one of them needs to be how many columns? 3 columns each, right? So 3 times 4 is 12, right? So we're gonna choose the nomenclature column 3, column 3, column 3, column 3. This is a column of 3 widths, unit widths, right? So there they are. There's 4 of them, right? There's 1, 2, 3, and 4. There's 4 of them inside of a row. And what are the size is indeed 600 divided by yes. Not in CSS, but yes in less or SAS, right? In less and SAS, you can have variables, you can have for loops, you can have functions, you can have all sorts of things, and then you have a compiler that runs your SAS or less or whatever you choose, and it generates CSS, right? It compiles it down to CSS. Yes.
I was reading about the pre-compiler, like SAS and less.
Yeah.
And I read that SAS has like more developers behind it.
Yep.
Their documentation tends to be more like
Yep.
developer looking, like it looks kind of
Yes.
good. Which one do you recommend?
SAS, definitely.
Okay.
That's what I see mostly in the industry. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. There are also compilers, inline compilers that you can load native, SAS. Right, it'll compile it on the fly, right, and generate the CSS right on the file. That's if you have good caching, that's a good idea. But if you don't have caching, that's very expensive. You compile it every single time, right? It's preferably to compile it once, right, and then gets deployed in production already compiled, pre-compiled. All right, so that last example here is that we have 6 columns, each one of 2 unit widths in size each, and that means that they have to be 100 pixels wide, right? So that it adds up to 600, and that's exactly what we have in column 2, is 100 pixels each. Make sense? And this is what Bootstrap does. Bootstrap takes this exact same idea and creates an industry strength grid system, right? That is very, very versatile. And this is what I want to introduce to you. First, I wanted to see it how we would build it from scratch. Yes. And now that we're going to see how Bootstrap does it, it'll make more sense, right? It won't be just plain old magic. So let's look at Bootstrap. So Bootstrap is one of several very prominent CSS libraries that are widely used in the development community, and it has tons and tons of nice little snippets of HTML and CSS that make it easy for the developer to build professionally looking websites, specifically for building more applications more than just building websites, right? Building widgets, building things that developers need to do. Forms, form elements are responsive. So you can get a hold of Bootstrap by going to getbootstrap.com, and I encourage you to read through their documentation. Just get familiar where things are. Before you invent something and you're thinking of something, see if Bootstrap or whatever library you're using, see if they already have something already built that you can just copy and reuse in your source code. Because it'll be a solution that has been proven. It's an industry strength. They have their own QA that makes sure that their code is very performance, right? We're going to be using a lot of the components that are in here in the components. A lot of their images. These are all open source, and they have all sorts of content like drop downs and again, instead of you building this, you just copy their snippet of code and then you can use it in your own. You have button groups that you can group together different buttons for doing pagination, or color schemes for different context. Input groups where you can group input fields along with labels or group them with buttons, clickable buttons, or check boxes and radio buttons, or with buttons on the right hand side or the left hand side, or group them together with drop downs. So there's quite a bit of small bits and pieces that please, before you reinvent the wheel, see if they already have something for you. Grab it and please feel free to use it. This is the standard way of developing today out there, and of just reusing this, right? Breadcrumbs, nav bars. We're going to be using nav bars quite a bit for tabs or using pills. Nav bars that can hold several actions together, like drop downs and check boxes and buttons and various links. Oops. And then also nav bars that can be stuck to the top or stuck to the bottom. You can fix them to the top or the bottom, which already we saw how to do it, right? Ourselves using fixed, right? But instead of doing it ourselves, let's use their code that has been thoroughly QA'd. Pagination, you have all sorts of buttons out there, but what it's hugely famous for, these grid systems, is for their grids. If you go to CSS, they fully document their grid system, right? So I encourage you to read through their grid system. We're going to be using it all throughout the semester, but again, for you to become familiar with it. So their grid system has two main mechanisms that they use. One of them is that you can target different screen sizes, right? Where for instance, if you're targeting mostly desktop applications, it allows you to lay it out into different columns and sidebars on left and right and middles and top and bottom, and then as the screen becomes smaller and smaller, it reverts to a just stacks the content just on top of another because it doesn't fit. Right, and it just stacks it, and they target different screen sizes, and they give them nomenclatures. They say screen sizes above 1200 we consider to be those large screens, right? Anything between roughly 1,000 or 992 to 1,200, we consider those to be medium-sized screens. Anything between 768 and 992, we consider those to be small screens. And anything below that is extra small screens, right? Like phones and tablets and whatnot. And they have a grid system for each one of these, right? So that you can decide that I want columns on a big screen, but I don't want columns on a small screen, right? Or you can override it and say, I want columns everywhere. Even at really tiny little screens that I can't almost read all those columns, right? You can override and decide how to lay it out. So let me go over some of the examples that I have here. Okay. Please take a look at the videos. Here's a grid system. So here's an example of a grid system. Can I edit this? Can I see this? Actually, I have another example that it's easier to view. Go to Bootstrap and look at the grid system. There we go. Here's another example. So here it is. Here we're using the Bootstrap grid system. The source code will be very familiar to you. These are all. This is a row. This is a row with a column that is 12 units wide. This is a row with two columns, each one of 6 units and 6 units. This is a single row with 3 columns, each of size 4. Yes. So it's very common. Here's one with 4 columns. If we look at the source code. Right, my hope is that you would feel right at home. Here's the row, right, with 1 column of size 12. See that? Never mind this LG for now, right? I'll talk about that in a minute. Then we have another row with 2 columns of size 6. Yes, and we know how that works, right? Using floats and clear both and whatnot. Everybody okay? Right? And so on and so forth. So we have another row with 3 columns of 4, and we have a row with 4 columns of 3, and so on and so forth. Everybody okay? All right. I just gave it away. So here it is. Here's the grid system, and notice that what happens is that as the size shrinks from a large screen into a medium-sized screen, right? Notice what happens, right? It reverts to its normal block behavior. See that? Everything stacks up, right? And now if it becomes even smaller and becomes a small screen, again, it resizes to another threshold, right? Another threshold, and it becomes smaller and smaller up until you reach a smallest screen. This is the extra small screen, and then there's what you might see on a phone, which is perfectly readable, right? We don't have columns, right? They just stack up. And that's the behavior you saw there that says LG. So that you see that when it says LG, meaning I want these columns for large screens. If it's not a large screen, I don't want the column. Right? I want you to revert to your normal behavior of just behaving like blocks, right? And blocks just stack one on top of another. Everybody okay? Right? So let's go back here and let's look at another example. Let's look at the grid medium. Let's look at that. Notice that this one is targeting medium-sized screens, right? Notice that for the large-sized screens, it behaves exactly the same way, right? As it becomes smaller and smaller and it reaches the threshold where Bootstrap considers this to be a medium-sized screen, notice what happens. See that? See the threshold? Notice that it keeps the same layout, right? But the columns are just smaller, right? To fit up until you reach the next threshold, right? And when you reach the next threshold of being small size screen, it goes back, reverts to the normal behavior of block, right? And everything stacks up all the way down to the extra small screens. You saw that, right? So this is what grid systems allow you. This is what they buy you. They says, I am going to be responsive. This is what we mean by responsive, right? The content responds or adapts, right, to the size of the parent screen. Right? And all your content that you build in this class needs to be responsive, right? Needs to accommodate the smaller screens. All right, so here's the smaller screen. All right, so let's look at the last one, or one more. Let's look at one more. the small screen, right? So the small screen, again, for the large screen, it behaves the same way. Medium-sized screen, I still want the same layout, same columns. But now when I get to small screen, I still want the same layout, the same number of columns. But notice that the smaller I get, the less and less the columns make sense, right? So that's why it allows us to revert back to the original behavior of just stacking content on smaller screens. See that? But you could be, notice that this is going to go back to stacked, now stacking up, right, so that you can view it on small screen, right, on extra small screen. And the last one is for extra small. If we render it again, for larger is okay, with this is medium, smaller. But if I really, really, really want to keep the same layout, even with the smallest of screens, right, you can do that. You say, okay, even in a phone, I want my 2 columns, or my 3 columns, or even my 4 columns. Notice that it makes almost no sense to do that, right? That's why the grid allows you to turn on and off responsiveness for different sizes. Make sense? All right. And the way to achieve these behaviors, if you look at the source, page source, right? To achieve this, we are using here column XS. See that? All right, that's how we target that we want this layout for LG, large screen, MD for medium, SM for small, or extra small XS. Everybody okay? Yes.
So Bootstrap recognizes automatically.
Yes, the rules are assigned to the class, right?
And then can you have multiple dashes with multiple properties?
You can. Yes, you can, for instance, combine XS with SM, for instance, right? And say that that for large screens, I want it to spread up into 4 columns. For medium-sized screens, I only want 2 columns, right? Split into 2 and 2. So it could be either 1, 2, 3, 4 in large screens, or 1, 2, 1, 2 in medium-sized screen, and then smaller screens, right, just stack up, right? So you can combine. So as you resize, right, different rules will trigger, right, and we'll use those different layouts. Yep. And we'll play around with that in class quite a bit. All right, everybody okay? Everybody still with me? All right. What else? Let's see. So there's quite a few other examples here. I'm not going to go over all of them. Maybe just forms real quick. Forms here just using form elements to style them and make it look pretty. The only other thing that I'm going to point out here is that notice that these forms are responsive too, right? Because we're using some of the snippets from here. If you go to Bootstrap and you go to forms, here you can copy forms that are already responsive, right? Meaning that the forms will look one way on large screens, but will look differently on a phone. Okay, so for instance, in this example here, notice that this form renders inline, right, from left to right, like in a header or a footer, right, on large screens. But as a form, as a page becomes smaller and smaller, notice that they become rendered from top to bottom, right? Same thing for the horizontal forms. Here, when you have enough screen real estate, the label renders on the left-hand side, and the field renders on the right-hand side. But as you become smaller and smaller, it reverts to top-down, right, where the label is on top and the input field is at the bottom. Yes? Right. Again, if you make use of the snippets of code from Bootstrap, this is for free. Right? So just make use of that content already there. There'll be plenty of other things to worry about in class. All right. This is these we are humans constantly like to create layers of abstraction, right? Once we understand something enough, we just wrap it in a nice package and just reuse it, right? And then forget about the details, right? And we just keep building and building higher and higher levels of abstraction. All right. Okay, so we've done enough with Bootstrap. Let's actually start building something. All right. Let's go to Bootstrap. If you go to the very first page, if you go to the Getting Started page, here it gives you a couple of example pages that you could use as your starting place, right? So, for instance, you have this one, which is a very the minimalistic Bootstrap page that is already responsive, right? So if it becomes smaller, notice that the top level menu collapses into a drop down, right? If it's too small, so that's one of the simplest one. Here's another one that gives you kind of like a jumbo box at the top, so you can do some marketing, and gives you all sorts of tables and responsive tables that they don't. I don't know if they're responsive. Are they? No, they're not responsive. Really? No, they're not responsive. Thumbnails and buttons and badges and drop downs that you can already reuse and start building for yourself. Yes? Okay. So any one of these is a good starting point. Here's another one, more for like a marketing thing that you might be selling something, or different products that you want to show here, or different activities that is happening in your website or your web application. Let's maybe get started with this one. Okay. Or maybe this one. Let's start with this one. So this be the home page of our assignment, right? It could also be the home page for your project. So let's grab the content here and let's create it inside of public assignment, and I'm going to put it under undergraduate, right? So this will be our landing page, our index page, and we're going to drop the content here. Okay. So let's look at what we just copied. Right, there's quite a bit of stuff here. One of them is that we are referring to the Bootstrap min library. If you hover over, notice that I can't click on it, so I don't actually have it installed locally. Right. So let's install it. One easy way to install it is to from the terminal, you can run npm install Bootstrap. What that's going to do is that it's going to download the Bootstrap library. It's going to put it in your node modules, right? So somewhere here, there it is, Bootstrap, right? So it copy all the content here. It can't actually live here. You need to move it into a public directory, right? Everything outside of the public directory is not accessible to the browser, right? So you need to move it into somewhere where it is accessible. So I'm going to copy that. Here we have fonts and JavaScript and CSS that are specific to Bootstrap. I'm going to grab that, and I'm going to put it under the public directory, under assignments, undergraduate. One typical place to put libraries that are not yours, right, that are either somebody else's that you're reusing, is either in a directory called lib, right, that's a very common place to put it, or put it maybe in a directory called vendor, meaning from some third-party vendor that it's not you, right, you're reusing somebody else's library. I'm going to put it in vendor. I'm going to paste it in there. Okay. Typically, we put the name of the vendor so we know from where we got it. So Bootstrap. So I'm going to put it in there. Let's say OK. There it is. Okay. So we have the Bootstrap. Let's fix this this file. It's actually where it's under vendor. Under Bootstrap dist. Okay, that looks okay. Bootstrap theme, I believe it's there as well. So let's copy that as well, and so that it's looking at the local content. Here we have some fixes for IE. I'm not going to bother with IE, so I'm going to remove that. Theme CSS, that looks like a file that we didn't copy down. Let's see, where is it? There it is, this theme. Right, so we can grab that. We can say click on themes, and there it is. I'm going to save that to my local file. Let's see, where do we put it? I think, is that Bootstrap? Is that the right place? I believe so. No, wait a minute, what Bootstrap is that? Can I go up? Vendor? That's graduate. Oh, okay. Assignment, undergraduate. vendor Bootstrap. And let me put the theme in there. There we go. Let me fix this as well. So this goes where? It says in vendor. It's inside a Bootstrap theme. And notice that it's not yellow anymore, and I can hover and click on it. So that's correct. I'm going to not handle IE. I'm not going to handle this IE either. All right, so we have those links at the top. And down below, notice that we have several scripts that are being loaded, right? Yes? I'm sorry? Where's that? Oh, favicon? I'll leave it. Not now. Thank you. Notice that these scripts, typically scripts would live also in the head. Okay? That's actually where, syntactically, where they should be, right, in the head. But typically they're not put there, especially if these are libraries that are fairly, very heavy libraries like jQuery and Angular. All these libraries are fairly big, especially if you're not downloading it from a CDN. If it's from a CDN, it matters less. But typically these libraries are expensive to download, and the browser would literally get stuck waiting for that to download before it continues to render the page, right? So it could add a couple milliseconds to the download time before anything is rendered for the page, right? And some websites, they live or die on that millisecond, right? So people waiting, not waiting those milliseconds and just going away somewhere else, right? So what typically is done is that they put all these heavyweight libraries way at the bottom, at the very last thing that it gets downloaded. See that? It's right inside of the body, right? It's the very last thing that gets loaded. Here we have Bootstrap, which we do have. I think it's in vendor. I think it's Bootstrap and the distribution. We're not using that, and we're not using IE. Are we using jQuery? We're not using jQuery just yet. Well, we can install it too. You can say npm install jQuery. I'm not sure which version it's going to download. Bootstrap. Let's see, jQuery. Where are you? jQuery. jQuery. Which version? 3.2.1. That's fine. We can grab the distribution for jQuery. Copy that. Do I want the whole thing? No, I don't want the whole thing. I just want the distribution. So we can put that also under our vendor, undergraduate vendor. And let's create a directory for jQuery. Okay, and let's paste that in there. Now remember, I mentioned that ideally, when you're going to go into production, right, all these libraries you would be linking to CDNs, right? Now, for development purposes, we're going to have them locally. We're going to host them ourselves. As we build our application, having them locally is going to allow us to work faster. There will be autocomplete. Our IDE will work with us. Right? We'll find all these references to all these functions, all these classes and whatnot. But in production, when we're done with the application and it's about to be deployed for real, all these links should link to CDNs as opposed to local libraries. Okay? Yes.
Why did you only use the list from jQuery?
I'm sorry?
Why did you only use the distribution from jQuery?
The rest is source. It's a source code that all the files that get compiled and zipped up into one single file, into the distribution file, right? So jQuery is a very large library. It has its own build process, and when you run the build process, it generates a single deployable file, right, which is the jQuery min file, right, and that's the one we're going to be using. Yeah, if you look at the original one in jQuery, notice that I have you source, right, that for each one of the modules, right, which is thousands of files, right. So we just want one file that brings everything together into one single deployable file. Yep.
Is the same logic applied to other libraries?
Yeah, Bootstrap. They all behave the same way. Angular too. Just like we do, and we're going to split up our JavaScript into dozens, hundreds of files, right? When you go to production, right, they all get zipped up into one single JavaScript file, right? That means that you have to code, right, understanding that your file eventually it's not going to live in its own little file, right? So it needs to be able to survive the build process, right? It has its own techniques on how to code, knowing that you're going to go through a build process, and we'll talk about that as we go. All right, so we have that. We have Bootstrap Min, although we're not going to be needing Bootstrap Min just quite yet. All right, so we have our homepage. Let's run this. Let's run this and let's try to navigate there. Let's see, local hosts. Let's render. Let's go to assignments. We have the undergrad version and we have the index page. There it is. There it is. So this is our homepage, right? Our homepage. Notice that I've created a little browser that allows you to browse the entire content of the file system, which you sort of vendor, see jQuery. You can see all the content here. Right, same thing with Bootstrap and lib and everything which is empty. And we have index right now. Everybody okay? All right, awesome. All right, so let's see, what else do we need here? Let's go back to undergraduate. We have our index page. And first let's build maybe a login page. So we have a login.html. And I had already given you one of those files. Let's build it. Let's build it. We're going to need here a Bootstrap. So let's load Bootstrap. So that's link, and that's let's see, where is it? Href. It's under vendor, Bootstrap, CSS. Nope. No, this is CSS and Bootstrap. Oh, dist, right? Dist. Sorry, that's dist. This and this is CSS, and that is Bootstrap Min, right? There we go. And we need to tell it what it is. It's a style sheet. There we go. And we're going to have here maybe an outer div. We're going to have maybe an H1 with that says login, right? And a couple of input fields. So maybe an input field where we could put in the username, and another input field for the password, and maybe a button that says login. All right, so let's navigate there. If we go to login, there's what our login would look like. It looks ugly. We can start painting it, right, and making it look a little prettier by adding some of its Bootstrap libraries or classes, right? So for instance, we can paint the input field with form control. Form control is a very common style that makes it behave like a block element as opposed to as an inline. Notice that the default is to behave like an inline, right? Input fields are by default inline elements. See that? They render from left to right, right? But they look so much nicer if they behave like block elements, form control. So there they are. Notice that there are no margins on the left. So a common class to use to add margins and center your content is container. Also, that's a very common class in Bootstrap. Let's re-render. Now notice that it's centered. It gave me some width for the page, right? Let's keep going. So let's paint this with form control as well. There we go. Yep. Let's paint that button. Let's paint the button. We're going to say maybe class btn. So that renders it, looks a little prettier. Let's make it a block element, so btn block, right? And maybe give it some color. And some of the colors that are available, primary is for blue, danger is for red, yellow is warning, I think. Let's go with primary. Go primary. There it is. And maybe we want another button that we wanted to maybe register, and we'll make that green. So we'll go that with success is green. Success. There we go. Yes.
So, Bootstrap CSS should be in line with the rest of the CSS
In line. What do you mean?
Like, you get the, oh, never mind, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you thought maybe this was style?
Yeah.
Yeah, no style. No style. Yep. All right, so let's see, what else? Plus, we might want to have some labels that, that describe that I'm asking for a username. And here I am asking for a password. So this is a password. Let's see, what else? Notice I'm adding white spaces for me as a developer so that it makes it easier for me to read. So there they go. Also, notice one thing that I don't like about some of this styling is that the input fields, notice how there's no margins between them, right? But there are margins, right, or between the buttons, but not between the input fields, right? So we can, if we don't like that styling, the default styling, we can override that we can override Bootstrap by providing our own style sheet. Right, and a typical place to put our local style sheet, that our own style sheet, is to put it under a dedicated directory CSS, right, where we can put a file there that has our own style sheet. So we can put styles.css in there. Okay, and in here we can override and say, hey, I don't like the fact that the input fields with the class form control. Right, I want to add some margins to it. Right, maybe between at the bottom of each one of the input fields, I like to push down maybe 5 pixels. So I could say that margin at the bottom is 5 pixels. Right, so if I re-render, it doesn't work. Wait, what? Did I not link it? Oh, thank you. Okay, didn't link it. Thank you. So href. Let's go down to CSS and to styles. And rel style sheet. There we go. Okay, there it is. Right. So now we're consistently putting this white spaces, right, so that everything's nicely spaced out, right. And we would expect the same thing in your own projects, in your own assignments. Yes, that everything's nicely consistent use of white spaces. Yes. All right. So let's add some. Let's keep adding some of the labels. So this is password. And remember that we want to make sure that we increase the touchable area, especially on a phone, so we can give IDs to these things, right? Unique identifiers, username, and make the labels also clickable, right? So that if you click on the label, it will focus on the input field. So this is a label for username, right? So if we click on the username, right, the input field also becomes focused. Same thing for the password. I'll leave that to you. All right, so there we go. So we have the login page. I don't quite like that it's, well, yeah, let's leave it like that. That's okay. I was going to say that a different container class that I prefer, but it's personal, my preference, is to use a container fluid, right? That basically it always treats it as if it was block, right? Regardless of the size of the screen. I personally prefer this one. A lot of folks prefer the other one. It still gives me margins on either side, gutters, right? But it always behaves blocks all the time, the same width, right? It's 100% extends the entire width of the page. Either one is fine. I'll leave that up to you. Everybody okay? All right, so we have the login and register. We could do something similar with the register page, right? The register page is going to look almost exactly the same, so I'm going to just copy it, register.html, and give it a different label. We're going to say that this is register. The difference here is that it's going to have 2 passwords. One is going to be password, the other one might be verified password. Notice that the input fields, by default, they're text fields, right? So they're free-form text. You can type anything you want. Passwords, you can add additional behavior by saying that by overriding its default type, and we say that this is a password. And what this will do is that it will allow you to type, and it will hide the whatever you're typing, right, from any prying eyes. So let's grab that. and let's have that. So register, you can type whatnot. Make sense? Everybody okay? All right. Now notice that these are buttons, right? And that would be fine. Eventually, these buttons need to run some kind of code, right? Actually register somebody or look somebody up, right? Whether they exist or not. But for now, we're not going to have any of that, right? These are going to be hyperlinks, right? We want the navigation, we want it to happen without any logic, right? We don't want that just yet. So I'm going to change this a little bit. Actually, this should say register, right? Register, and this is going to be cancel. So the login page, right? The login page, instead of being buttons for now, I'm going to change this to be hyperlinks. Right? These are going to be hyperlinks. Notice that they render exactly the same way. Login, refresh. Notice that they handle as if they look like buttons. See that? Right? And that's again, that's a Bootstrap rendering things any which way you want it. Right? It's a hyperlink, but it's rendering like a button. And later on, they are actually going to be interchangeable. Right? There's a actually I prefer to use hyperlinks because I could choose to have them behave like hyperlinks or buttons, whereas buttons can only behave like buttons. Okay. So anyway, in the login page, if I log in, typically where I want to go is I want to go to the register page. Actually, no, I want to go to where? The profile page, which we don't have, right? We don't have the profile, so profile. We'll have to build a profile in a minute. If instead I click on the register, I want to go to the register page, right? So let's try that. If I click on the register, indeed, I navigate to the register page, right? And similarly, from the register page, if I click on cancel, on the cancel button, I want to go where? Go back to the login page. If I click on the register, I will go to the profile page, right? I'll have you finish that up. Right, everybody okay? Everybody still with me? All right, awesome. So let's look at the profile page, and let's create the profile page. It's going to look very similar. Well, it's going to have some aspects of the login page. Let's copy that. So this will be profile, and let's see, we'll call it profile, right? And it's going to have, it's going to display the username. But presumably we don't like you to, we wouldn't want you to be able to change your username, so we can make this read-only. So it'll show you the username, but you can't change it. And you can set a default value of Alice, right? So let's see if we cancel and then go to login. It goes to the profile page. Notice that Alice, you can't type on it, right? It's only read-only. Make sense? Right, and value allows you to give you the default value for that input field. Everybody okay? For password, maybe perhaps it allows you to change your password. So maybe you can have here 2 passwords, so you can change it. So this is type password, and maybe a verify password, so you can change your password. Verify password. Maybe also allows you to set your first name, right? Because you haven't told us what your first name is. So there's first name. Notice that this needs the IDs and needs the for, right? So you'll add that for the assignment. Please have that. There in the rubric, we're going to look for those things, right? That you have the IDs, that you have the for, that everything has nicely spaced, everything's evenly spaced, and I think we're doing quite a bit for you, right? So here's last name. Oh, sorry. So this is first name and this is last. And lastly, we can maybe have an email, and the email can be of type email. Email. Can't type. And the nice thing about this is that on a phone browser, right, or Android or iOS, it'll bring up the correct keyboard, right, for the correct data type, right. So if it's a number, it'll bring up the number keyboard. If it's a date, it'll bring up the date widget. If it's an email, it'll bring up the email. If it's a phone, it'll bring up the phone keypad, right. So yes, please make sure you use the correct data type, right? So that you increase the you improve the experience of the end user. Everybody good? Right? For logout, if I want to log out, maybe I have log out, and maybe I want to change the color to be danger, and this takes me back to the login page. So I am logged out. All right? Right. So this is the profile page. This is what it looks like so far. Now in the assignment, we ask you to make it so that you have a header at the top, right, and a footer at the bottom, right? So to do that, in Bootstrap we can copy one of their templates from their components. If you go to their nav bar, we have a fixed nav bar somewhere down here. Fixed top. Let's create a nav bar. Really simple. Okay, so here's a really complicated nav bar. So let's grab that. Let's see what that creates. Oops. Let's grab that, and let's put it at the top here, right before our profile. Okay, so let's go back and re-render. Notice that adds a bar at the top, but notice that it scrolls with the content. See that, right? But what we'd like to be able to do is that so that it gets stuck to the top, right, and doesn't scroll with the main content. Also notice that it's responsive, right? So that it collapses into the right-hand side. Although we don't need that for the assignment, right? For the assignment, we just need, I believe, just one button. I believe that's what the assignment asks us to do. But nevertheless, let's see how we can make it stick to the top. And to do that, again, there's some code here that you can see. Fixed top is somewhere here. Fixed to the top. There it is. So to fix something to the top, the only thing we need to do is add the additional class, either navbar fixed top or navbar fixed bottom, right? And that will fix it to as a header or as a footer, right? Yes.
Is that one for like anything, or does it have to be a nav?
It's only for nav. Yep. So let's add it here, right here. So navbar fixed top. If we go back to the profile, notice that it worked, right? Notice that if I scroll here, if I scroll, notice that the top is fixed, right? But notice what happened to my profile. H1, right? That we had there, right? We might say, well, you don't want it actually. In the brand over here, we could put that this is the profile, right? And that is enough, right, for us to know where we are. We don't really need the header, so we might say, well, okay, then let's remove the header. So let's remove this H1, and notice that now we don't see the username, right, and the password. So it's happening what we saw earlier, right? Since it's using the fixed position, right? All the content underneath has nothing to push it down, and so we need to either go back to this div and make sure we add the margins, right? Or we can just push the entire body, right? So let's do that. Let's do that in our styles. So let's go to our styles, right? And we can say that for the entire application, right, or anybody who loads this style, we're going to add a margin at the top, margin top of 50 pixels. There it is. It's not quite enough, so let's maybe go with 60 pixels or 70 pixels. There we are. All right, so there we have the username back. Let's do the same thing for the bottom. So let's go back to Bootstrap and copy a navbar again. Let's see if we can get away with just copying this. All right, so let's go back here in the profile and let's paste under here a footer. So that's going to be our footer, and we'll put here footer. And let's refresh. And there's our footer. But our footer, let's see. Our footer noted that it scrolls with the content. See that? So what we want to do is use one of Bootstrap's, again, fixed bottom, which is way down here. Right? Let's grab that and let's paste it to the nav bar, and now it should be stuck and fixed to the bottom. There it is. So it's stuck. But notice that we have the same exact problem. See that? We can't scroll all the way down to the button, right? We can't see the button. So we have to do the same thing we did for the header. We need to do for the bottom. So we're going to say margin bottom, give it 50 pixels. Let's see if that's enough. So now we can scroll through a little. I guess we need a little more, 60 pixels. There we go. All right, so now we can scroll all the way to the right. Yes?
How do you make it to be the layout is instead of specific pixels?
What do you mean? I'm sorry.
How do you make the body be more relative to the footer itself instead of that? Because you can change the footer with something that's 200 pixels and then that could change.
So you mean the footer would change?
Yeah, well, generally it won't.
Yeah.
But can you just change the
No. You can't. You would need JavaScript for that. Yeah, because you've removed it from the rendering, right? So it's not interacting with anyone else, right? So the body or all the other content is no longer interacting with the footer, right? It's not even aware that the footer is there, so it wouldn't push anything anywhere else, right? It was removed from the outside, like if it was part before, right? And the footer grew, everything would be pushed, and everything is relative. That's the default behavior how HTML is rendered, right? Everything is relative to everything else. But when you start using positions absolute or position fixed, you are saying no, I don't want that, right? I am handling the rendering. Yeah. What else? Okay, so that gives us the profile. Yes.
So when you're like resize and then like automatic like Bootstrap automatically like changes the layout.
Yeah.
There's JavaScript running, right?
No JavaScript.
So this is the browser then?
This is all the browser. Yes. Oh, this is the browser. It's using a technique called media queries, which is documented right here. Let's go over that. Right. So let's if you go in the CSS, right, and you take a look at the grid system implementation. It uses what these media queries, right? What this says is it's almost like an if statement, right? That says, hey, let me look at the size of the screen, right? And depending on the size of the screen, I'm going to apply these CSS rules. And if the size of the screen is something else, I'll apply these other CSS rules, right? And so this is a very old technique that has been around for quite a while. The original intention was that you could target rendering either on a printer or on a screen or on a projector, and you can target different devices, right? So that for instance, when you print, you don't want to see any of the marketing and any of the ads and whatnot. You just want the text, right? So you would apply a CSS style sheet that would remove all that, right, and would just give you just plain text, right? So today. We are reusing these old ideas in novel ways, right? We're saying we're going to be responsive to the browser and say we're going to take these so it's at media, and you create a rule here. It says I want for this size of screen, right, between 768, a minimum of 668, I'm going to apply these rules, right? So all these rules would apply for extra small. All of these will apply for small. All these will apply for medium, and so on and so forth. Okay. So if you open up the Bootstrap library, you'll find all these at media all over the place, right? And so as you move, you're triggering different CSS rules. Yes.
These things would be in the CSS file.
Yes. So notice that we have these at, right? These are variables, right? That we can also compile. You can download the CSS library in SAS or less, right, and recompile it locally on your machine, right? So if these sizes that they're targeting, 768 or 992 or 1200, don't apply to your particular device, right? You can change that. You can change the less code or the SAS code from the original source code, and you can recompile Bootstrap for your own particular uses, right? All right, I think I'm gonna leave it here. Any questions? So I'm gonna push this to GitHub, right? And so feel free to reuse any of this for the assignment or getting started for your own project. Remember, for Sunday, we're expecting that you already have some idea on what project you're going to be working on for the rest of the semester. You can change your mind a little later, but it's a very short semester, and it would be very, very risky to change it mid-semester, so it being such a quick semester. So please think of something of what you might want to work on. All right. So ideally by Sunday you'll have a idea and create a wiki entry, a page where you describe the project to us. Okay. We're not going to actually grade it until the very later on, the last week, but certainly we want you to start working on it. Okay. All right. Thank you.